Hedgerows. What are they? Why are they so important for our environment? And why do we need to legislate to protect them? Welcome to the Bar of Ireland podcasts. In this episode, I'm joined by Leesha O'Driscoll, Senior Counsel, a practicing barrister and a member of Comhshaol, the Climate Bar Association. Leesha is part of a working group of barristers who have recently collaborated to draft a bill with the specific aim of protecting Ireland's hedgerows. The bill is being launched on the 4th of December at an event here at the Bar of Ireland. Leesha, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, Andrew, for having me. It's great to come and talk about this.
Just to begin, and then maybe a little bit about how the bill came about.
Okay, if you don't mind, I'm going to take the second part of that question first. So the bill came about because Alan Moore, who is from Hedgerows Ireland, came along to the bar and to the Climate Bar in the spring of 2022 and asked for assistance on drafting legislation to protect hedgerows. So a group of volunteers got together, and from then we basically did our research, agreed with him that legislative protection was needed, and hence we got to the bill. So first part of your question then is defining a hedgerow. That's a little bit more complicated. I suppose a lot of people will assume they know what we're talking about, and I think everyone probably will. But obviously, when you're going to make some law, you need to be a bit more specific. We have a working definition where we're talking about a linear feature between areas of land. This is going to be either internal to the property, so along fields, would say within a farm or an estate, or external to the property, the roadside boundaries that we often see. And it essentially contains three layers. You've got a ground flora or herb layer, a shrub layer, and a tree layer. So that's, I suppose, what we're talking about. We're not talking about your basic garden hedge of Grisselina or laurel or something like that. We're not too fussed about those.
What is it about hedgerows specifically that means they deserve protection in their own right?
So hedgerows are a hugely important feature of our landscape and natural heritage. I think a really important thing to point out is because they are linear features, they provide corridors for wildlife. So as our land gets more fragmented through intensified farming, for example, or road construction or big housing estates, the areas of wildlife become increasingly fragmented. And it's all the more important then that you have these corridors for our species to be able to still travel and not be limited to smaller and smaller areas, because they have to do that to go out and to breed, to feed, and also to pollinate. So that's kind of a key thing to bear in mind. They also play a really valuable role in the sequestration of atmospheric carbon. And then they also help reduce flooding and soil degradation. And they're just some of the aspects. But I would say, really, it's just so important to bear in mind, like 2/3 of our bird species nest in hedgerows and rely on them for food and shelter. I read one piece where bats, for example, will travel along hedgerows, and if they come to a gap of more than 5 meters, they will turn back. So if you think that our bats are protected species, and if we are removing our hedgerows at an unsustainable rate, which we believe we are, then you're damaging their environment and their habitat. It's also, and I'm giving you a very long answer here, but it's also because we have such a low level of woodland cover in this country that the role of hedgerows in our biodiversity is proportionally much greater than you would find, for example, in countries in continental Europe where they have a huge amount of woodland and forestry cover.
When it comes to existing legislation around this, is there any protection for hedgerows at the moment?
What I would say is there isn't directly the kind of protection that we believe needs to be there. There is some protection. Some of it's direct, some of it is indirect, and none of it is sufficiently adequate. So a kind of a whistle-stop tour is the Habitats Directive, obviously as implemented in Irish law, will protect any hedgerows that are within, special areas of conservation, and anything directly connected to that. Article 10 of the Habitats Directive does refer to by implication hedgerows, because it talks about linear and continuous structures which are features of the landscape of major importance for wild flora and fauna. But again, the article is phrased in terms that's very sort of aspirational, and it's saying that member states should endeavour in their land use and development policies to encourage the management of those features. We couldn't rely upon anything in there to give direct protection. The other two pieces of other European legislation worth mentioning would be the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive, which is implemented in Ireland in the Planning and Development Acts, and also in the EIA Agriculture Regulations 2011. Again, we'll say, taking the first one, the Planning and Development Acts, there are a number of criteria that should be considered when a project is looking for planning permission, which would encompass some of the functions that hedgerows fulfill. For example, you have to describe the environmental sensitivity of the area and consider the effect on biodiversity. However, hedgerows are not directly referenced, and in my experience, certainly their consideration in the assessment is not guaranteed or likely to be consistent across all decision-making bodies. Probably the main area where there's any level of direct protection is supposed to be in the Environmental Impact Assessment Agriculture Regulations of 2011. Now, they're currently under review, but as they exist at the moment, if an agricultural activity is going to involve the removal of more than 500 metres of hedgerow, or the removal of a field boundary where 5 hectares of land are being restructured, you have to apply for an environmental impact assessment. Sub-threshold projects, so that's less than those limits, don't have to apply unless it is thought that they might have a significant effect on the environment. The reality is that legislation is not working to protect hedgerows as we believe it should. And if I can just give you an idea of, what you might find in 100 metres of hedgerow, I came across a brilliant article in the British Wildlife Journal in 2015. And Dr. Robert Walton, an ecologist, published the results of his survey that had taken place over 2 years, whereby he documented every species that was apparent to the naked eye. So we're not talking about microscopic species, in an 85-metre length of hedgerow in Devon on his farm. And basically he found 2,070 species, which I think is amazing. Wow. Yeah, exactly. But not only that, he later sort of said that he thought that was probably an underestimate because he still had species in cardboard boxes and jars waiting identification. So he figured it was probably more like 3,000. So if you think that's the sort of biodiversity we're talking about, and under the current legislation, you could potentially be removing or up to just under 500 metres without having to have an environmental impact assessment. So basically, the answer to your short question, my very long answer, is that no, there isn't enough protection there at all. And we went through that work and that research before we came to the conclusion that it was appropriate to basically provide sort of tailor-made protection for hedgerows in our bill.
And when you were working on drafting the bill, were there any other examples of other jurisdictions that have done something similar?
Well, so the best one we could come across, and Hedgerows Ireland indeed pointed us to this at the very beginning, is the Hedgerows Regulations 1997 from the United Kingdom. So they've had pretty much 25 years of legislation in place protecting hedgerows. And I was very lucky to come across a recent edition of the book by Charles Minor on trees and hedgerows in the United Kingdom, whereby he commented that all the research indicated after 25 years of that legislation in place, basically the loss of hedgerows had had stopped and stabilised within about 10 years of that legislation being in place. Now, it's very technical and it's also very specific to the United Kingdom. So while we looked at it, it wasn't suitable for us to model our bill on that.
The bill touches on the category of significant hedgerows. What exactly is meant by this, and what does categorising them aim to achieve?
So that's a really good question, Andrew, because the problem we had as lawyers and not being parliamentary counsel is, how do we actually provide for protection in law for hedgerows, which, as we all know, are fairly widespread. In fact, they cover approximately 6% of the land. So it would be very nice to say everyone needs to stop removing their hedgerows, but that's not going to be workable, and nor would it be justifiable or proportionate interference. So we came up with the concept of the significant hedgerow. And basically, the principle of the bill is that significant hedgerows cannot be removed except in very specified circumstances. And you have to apply for permission to remove a significant hedgerow. So to the question then, what is a significant hedgerow? Well, they are the ones that we know through basically setting out specific criteria that they provide this really important value and services to us. So we have it set out in the bill. We have the principles and policies which would guide the minister to pass regulations which will actually set out the very specific technical detail. But the principles are that these are significant hedgerows are ones that provide ecosystem services. So that will include the role of the hedgerow in carbon sequestration and flood defence. Then you have the value and contribution that hedgerows provide to our archaeological, historical heritage or cultural sites or features. And some of our hedgerows are really ancient. Then we have the role that hedgerows play in agricultural systems and protection. So they help against the spread of animal disease, and they're providing shelter and shade for animals, but they also act as nutrient buffers, which is, again, a term I confess I only learned from the people in Hedgerows Ireland, but that's basically their ability to counteract the negative effects of nutrients that are being applied to the land. And then finally there is, and probably to my mind most importantly, there is the role they play in the maintenance and improvement of biodiversity. And that's, what I'm talking about, back to Dr. Robert Walton and his 3,000 species and the corridors. So that's why, to make our bill and the legislative intervention workable, all of the framework that's set up is the protection of these significant hedgerows.
Now that the bill has been drafted, what are the next stages that it needs to go through?
So we have really happy to be able to say that we were invited up to Leinster House to meet a number of TDs in the Green Party who are really supportive of our bill. So we met Brian Ledden, Stephen Matthews, a representative for Mark O'Cosig, and They had looked at the bill. We had sent them on the bill and our explanation document about it. They had been in touch, or rather Hedgerows Ireland had been in touch with them in the early stages when Hedgerows Ireland first came to us. They're very supportive of the bill and they plan to introduce it as a private member's bill. Quite soon, we hope. It's just going through sort of a clearing process at the moment. But we're obviously really happy about that.
Well, Leesha, thanks very much for joining me. Very much looking forward to the event on the 4th, where people will get an opportunity to learn more about the bill.
Absolutely. Really appreciate you having me in here today to talk about it.
For anyone who's interested in learning more about the Hedgerows Bill, and for more information on how you can engage with both the Bar of Ireland and the Client Bar Association on legal and environmental issues, please visit naturaljustice.ie.